Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Decrypting ESG Program Standards and Risk Mitigation. It is being presented by the National Apartment Association's Operations Committee. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA. I want to welcome all of our members in attendance. Thank you for joining us for this important topic. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this presentation with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Second, we have a lot of time at the end for live questions and answers, although actually you may also feel free to type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen at any time, and I will share them with our presenter. Now I am pleased to introduce our presenter. My apologies. Next slide, please. Paige Mueller is a co-founder and managing principal of Eigen10 Advisors, LLC, based in San Francisco. They provide real estate consulting services through all stages of the investment cycle, including ESG guidance. Previously, Paige had worked for GIC Real Estate on LaSalle Investment Management before building a successful pension consulting business. She holds an MBA from Indiana University and has served on numerous task forces and committees for her profession. Unfortunately, Paige's colleague in this presentation, Catherine Ann Marshall, will not be able to join her due to a household emergency, but Paige is more than qualified to carry the whole thing forward on her own. So with that, Paige, let me welcome you formally and turn things over to you.
All right, thank you, James. Nice to see all of you virtually, and definitely, as James said, feel free to type questions in that chat box as we go along, and happy to answer your questions as well. So today we're going to talk about ESG, and particularly really from a more practical perspective of what does it mean. Why is there so much interest in it already? I can say in our business in the past year, about a year ago, just a light switch flipped on and people started calling us quite frequently, particularly a lot of companies getting caught off guard that maybe a potential investor had said they really need to be reporting some sort of ESG requirements, or their current investors were calling it in with those requests as well. So we'll talk about why that light switch happened about a year ago. We're going to talk about all the changing standards and frameworks, and how to view all these different things. I know it's very confusing and kind of has its own little language that goes along with it. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about what we call Gen 3 ESG. And Gen 3 really is a focus on both investment outcomes and meeting some goals on environmental, social, and governance goals. And not only from a risk perspective, but thinking about it from an opportunity perspective as well, and more of an investment perspective. And then we'll talk at the end about just more effective and efficient approaches to actually starting to implement some sort of ESG programs. So first of all, what is ESG? We hear lots of acronyms in this industry, and ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. This table is from the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment. So this is one interpretation of it. There are lots of different interpretations. In fact, a company about a year ago looked globally and I think found 2,000 different interpretations and measurements of ESG issues. So it certainly varies, but in general, and we're talking about these sort of things. So from the environmental standpoint, it may be biodiversity, it may be issues around climate change, it may be pollution, it may be energy consumption, emissions, and other sorts of things. What types of energy and how do we operate more efficiently and with less energy, water, and waste needs. On the social side, we're certainly hearing lots about DEI over the past year. Lots of women's rights, lots of minority rights issues becoming very standard socially. Those are built into the ESG frameworks, but they also talk a lot about our tenants and our employees. So health and safety type of requirements, educational requirements as far as ESG issues. What sort of rights do they have? Are we talking to them and getting feedback from them? Working conditions, those sorts of things. And then finally, governance. Now, one thing that we hear quite a bit on governance is people will say, hey, we have institutional investor, we feel really good about governance. We already have in place all sorts of policies and processes to deal with anti-bribery, cybersecurity, data protection, legal type of things. We're on top of governance. Just be careful, because in the world of ESG, governance does cover those sorts of topics. It also covers lots of topics that focus on how are you managing ESG within your company. And so if you haven't implemented an ESG program, you probably don't have the appropriate governance factors and processes and policies in place, because they are very specific to ESG topics. So just be careful about understanding what those are. And we'll talk about that a little bit more today. So let's talk about why there's so much interest in ESG all of a sudden. I'm going to talk about really three main factors, and those are changing regulatory requirements, so things that are coming out of different government agencies. Number two, cost issues, primarily related to insurance costs and coverage. And then thirdly, increasing litigation and winning litigation around ESG issues. So this is a survey, and this is what we are seeing typically in the industry. Why, what are the incentives to start thinking about ESG and integrating it into your firm and your processes and policies in your firm? Number one that we're seeing is interest from clients. That may be investors. If you are pension fund investors, that may be from your pensioners. And we'll talk about a really interesting case that came up from a pensioner in one lawsuit. But it's also, fiduciary duty, making good investment decisions, thinking about your long-term investment outcomes, and capital type of issues. Just distinguishing your practice and your services and your reputation in the industry. So here we are on the cost side, talking about insurance. Insurance costs, I'm sure that you all are seeing, are rising quickly. Both, this is commercial, and these are, and this is why, because we are seeing insured losses rise substantially as well. So the insurance companies then have to have some way to cover these sort of losses, but they've really escalated over the past decade. We're seeing them continue to happen. James and I were just talking, I'm out in California, and the fire season seems to have started up already, which is really early for that to be happening right now. So the insurance costs are going up. But we're also seeing increased focus now from regulation. So the Federal Insurance Office, which is under the U.S. Department of Treasury, has issued a request for information in the past year. They are intending to use information from that to post a report by the end of this year to talk about what are the risks to the insurance industry and to really start parsing it out. So we're expecting to see more regulatory and issues on the insurance side, not just pricing. We're already starting to get little whiffs of anecdotal information on this. So it's not just cost. It may be that your deductibles change. You may have very high deductibles for certain types of climate risks that are specific to certain areas. And so that's where we think the insurance industry is going to become more sophisticated about what those are and starting to actually carve out some of those coverages or cause very high deductibles. So I mentioned at a conference a couple weeks ago, and I was surprised that this was one of the main takeaways that someone took from our presentation. But I will say, on the residential side, I'm in California. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area on the East Bay, very residential subdivision that was created in the 80s. We're right there, not up in the hills, the mountains. And just anecdotally, our home insurance, which we've never had a claim on, has been canceled twice in the past 4 years. And then you'll see our neighborhood board will just light up, and you'll see who doesn't, who else's insurance got dropped and who still has insurance, and the whole neighborhood starts scrambling for new insurance coverage. So we personally, anecdotally, are experiencing it already on the residential side. Hopefully the commercial side doesn't get to that point, but we are starting to hear some pieces here and there about those deductibles going up. If you have pension clients, you'll be familiar with ERISA. ERISA has to do with providing a fiduciary duty to your pensioners in particular. There's been quite a bit of talk around ERISA in terms of, is climate risk material or not? Under the current government, ERISA has deemed that climate is material. So it's something to think about, because if it is material, it's something that you should be considering in your investment decisions. We don't know how that will, it bounces back and forth. If we switch back to the Republicans going forward, we don't know, how that will affect that. But right now, that has been reversed from the previous administration, and it has been determined that you should be considering climate. Also under the pensions, they fall under the Government Finance Officers Association. They've been pretty silent on it. They have in particular picked up climate and as it relates to municipal bonds, so not specific to real estate, that has come out in the past year. We don't know how that will, be deemed going forward, but I will say that they are at least considering on the bond side, and in particular on the climate side. And you'll see continually the regulatory environment is very focused on climate. So of all your ES and G, it's the E, it's the climate, and where you have the regulatory risk. Lenders also very focused on climate. The FDIC just last month made a statement that climate-related financial risks pose a clear and significant risk to U.S. financial system. So this is the lending environment. This is your ability to get loans and your cost of your loans. They also, along with the Federal Reserve, are now starting to make a number of statements to send out requests for information and to be modeling this. We haven't seen anything specific come out from the Federal Reserve, that we've certainly seen it come out from other central banks around the country, again, focused on climate risk. So just something to be aware of and to be watching, because it could affect the lending market, and we're expecting to see further guidance on that side in the next year. Finally, the SEC. So this is public markets, but if you're a registered investment advisor, i.e. for most funds on the real estate side, private or public, SEC compliance and regulations may affect you. And the SEC just last month proposed rule changes that would require registrants. So again, if you're a registered investment advisor, I would be thinking about this to include climate-related disclosures. Now, this is open for feedback. So we'll hear more in the next couple months. There is already pushback from certain states on this, but again, we're behind the rest of the world, and there are other stock indices that certainly require this already. So our feeling is it's probably in some way moves forward. It may take one step forward and two steps back for a while, but this is also coming. So not only for public markets, but I think if you're a registered investment advisor and you have a fund, I would be watching this as well. So that's national. Local, there are already regulations coming into place. So the New York just announced in the last year energy efficiency upgrades. If you can't meet these energy efficiency issues by, I think it's 2025, you do have some time, there will be fines. So that's coming. In San Francisco, out where I am, there's already so many regulations. I think you're basically building some sort of LEED certified building just to get in, the regulations met in this area. So we're certainly seeing this happening both locally as well as nationally. So why do these, governments care about it? Well, real estate really creates one of the highest emissions of all the industries, and you'll see it whenever there are emissions report. Real estate, buildings will be up there in some component of a very large component of emissions. And we have, hundreds of governments around the world that have already instituted net zero goals. The U.S. again has been a laggard, so globally there is expectations of some sort of reduction in emissions, and real estate is up there. So we think it will continue to be a focus of the regulatory environment. Litigation. Litigation is going up. We had a really interesting case, well, a year and a half ago in 2020. It happened in Australia. It was actually a pensioner that brought the case. It was a retail employee superannuation trust, which is the equivalent of our pensions here in the US. And a pensioner said, you're not investing, you're not following your fiduciary responsibility because you're not considering climate change in your investment program. The lawsuit went forward. The pensioner did not have to pay any legal costs, and the pension lost. And it's a pretty sizable pension. And they agreed as part of the settlement that they would in fact consider climate risks in their investment analyses. And they also agreed to set a net zero goal to 2050 as part of that settlement. We are seeing some of the larger pensions here in the US start to set those net zero 2050 goals. So again, if you have pension clients, this may just be a regulatory or legal risk that they want to avoid, and start to put those sort of programs in place. This survey just came out last month. It was an expectation of legal risk related to ESG, and the corporate lawyers are their expectation of more ESG lawsuits coming up rose from 21 to about 37%. So over a third of the lawyers in this survey thought that there was going to be more ESG litigation coming up. All right, I'm going to move now to the change in reporting environment. And I think this is what makes people's head really spin. Is there so many changes happening in this market? So it's not like there's one standard and you can just pull it up and meet the standard and everything is good. There are lots of different standards floating out there. So just as some background, we have what we would call generation one of ESG, and we had to start somewhere, and this is a great place to start. It started at the building level. So you would see and still see things like LEED certification, Energy Star programs to start measuring your utilities and thinking about your energy usage. They were great to, as a start to get into this. They're still around. They still have value to understanding this at the building level. But what we found is that they didn't effectively measure actual performance. So there were some issues around, people report one or two buildings, but they had 10 buildings that were not LEED certified or not Energy Star and were actually big, energy hogs. So we had those sort of issues happening. We didn't have fund and entity level benchmarking. Again, it was just building level. So there's pushback in how those systems were being used and the fact that they weren't really complete at the fund and the entity level. We then had what we call generation two of ESG reporting, more comprehensive ES and G factors into those sort of frameworks. They do provide fund and entity level benchmarking and performance. So you can't just send in your best building and say, hey, we got a great LEED building. You have to start reporting, your full portfolio. Again, not always creating benefits either on the investment side or on the environment and social and government side. So they could be subject to greenwashing. Some of these are just reporting frameworks. So they say, if you're going to report what you're doing, you should say these sort of things or report these sort of things. Some of these systems are scoring frameworks. So it's good to know which one that you're looking at. So we're running about a decade in each framework. And now in the 2020s, we're starting to move into what we call generation 3 of ESG. And we're really just starting. I think a lot of firms are trying to get up to speed in Gen 1 and Gen 2 right now. But firms are starting to move into Gen 3. And what we mean by Gen 3 is measurable and thoughtful approach to ESG of how does it really affect your investment performance and how does it really affect your ability to make improvements on ESG metrics and which of those metrics really matter and improve the performance of your firm, either on the investment side and or on the ESG side. And so you'll see here on the right, there's lots of different things that get included in these frameworks. It may, and you'll see there on the big orange piece of that pie, measurements. So measurements are a big part, and that's property level measurements of energy, of emissions, and of waste and of water. That's a significant part of a number of frameworks, not all of them, but that's frequently a big part. So as a property or asset manager, it's something to be thinking about. Can you even measure these sort of factors from your buildings? Building certifications may be a component of some of the frameworks. That would be things like LEED by well buildings, et cetera. Just things that certify that your building has some sort of ESG components built into it. And then you'll see the big blue box on the left, firm structure and policies, policies and processes having to do with ESG or another big component. Tenants on the bottom and community, and then risk management. So how are you thinking about particularly climate risk, but also other sorts of risks? It could be social risk, community risk, et cetera, on risk management. And then you need to set up some sort of data measurement and some sort of target. So here's where we are now. We can measure where we are now, and here's where we want to be and how we think we're going to get there and how long it's going to take us to get there. So these are the general components weighted differently and considered differently based on different frameworks. So here's the head spinning graph. These are only a few of the ESG frameworks that are out there right now. They're the ones that we see more commonly applied to real estate in the US. But the frameworks vary by asset class. They vary by, are they targeting governments, for example? There are frameworks around which governments, might think about how to, how to plan their urban environments. So there's different frameworks for different usages, different asset class, different types of users. And these are the ones that we see most frequently in real estate in this country. And note that here we have on the left kind of the Gen 1, the LEED and the Energy Star. So this is where we start at least the building level. These then can be used in addition to some of these other types of reporting frameworks here in the middle. And then recently, just at the United Nations Climate Conference in November 2021, you'll hear COP26, a new global standard came out called ISSB. And the goal of ISSB is to be a global standard. So you don't have different standards depending on what country you're investing in. And it's just a framework that hopefully will help to consolidate some of these very different measures from different countries and different asset classes. So we are waiting to see how that comes out. You'll notice all sorts of acronyms here. And so this world kind of has its own little language, which makes it even more confusing. And then at the bottom of the slide, note a couple things that are important and might be helpful guidelines for you. NCREIF PREA, as part of the reporting standards, does have an ESG module. It just came out. So you can look on their website and see what they have deemed to be, high priority and really standard level requirements on ESG. So that may be a helpful thing to review. The Institutional Limited Partners Association, there in the bottom in the middle, ILPA, just also came out with new parameters around their DDQ, so due diligence questionnaire. So if you are prepping the capital raise on either side of that, they'll give you some questions that they think are important and should be included when you are evaluating any investment partners. I will say that ILPA is very diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI focused, and they do have some of their own standards around DEI. So if that's something that is important to you, that's a good one to look through, either to prep to capital raise, or if you're thinking about reviewing other investment partners, some questions that may come up. So a couple of those frameworks that we see getting used quite a bit right now and coming up quite a bit. One is GRESB or GRESB, depending on which country that you're working in. Two things are important. This is a scoring system, so you will enter data and it will score you, and it will also compare you to a peer group based on what kind of parameters, how you describe your portfolio. So that's helpful. They do require you to enter all properties, so that's helpful as well. And they do have a broad ESG coverage. They also allow for development properties versus stabilized properties, so you can fill out a development module rather than, that's different from your operating partners. And note that where we see, people having trouble with this particular system is you do have to really plan ahead, because there's a large part of the system that has to do with building certifications and with collecting that information at the property level. So again, energy, water, waste, emissions, and that can really take companies some time to even start collecting. And ideally, you have that for the full year when you're reporting that. Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So remember, the regulatory environment is very focused on climate. So if you're going to start somewhere, start with climate. This seems more onerous, I think, than it really is once you start going through it. There are specific things that they want you to do. There are specific types of analyses that they want to do. It's not as horrible and onerous as it first looks to do, and allows comparison to peers. And so this is another area, if you're going to start somewhere, this might be a good one to start with. But again, this is going to just carve out that climate component. So we, right now we're seeing a lot of companies just chasing scores, and they're chasing scores because someone told them they had to, and that their investors are pushing them to do that. And that's really the Gen 2 approach. But you have to start somewhere. You have to get familiar with the information and the processes. And so you start somewhere. There's a lot of pushback right now on the Gen 2. The Wall Street Journal has just been on a roll of producing one article after another, but it's not just the Wall Street Journal. We're seeing it from a number of different, and including the SEC has criticized investors for not having results. So again, the idea is that you maintain investment results, but they also create real differences in environmental, social, and governance goals. So what that means is you can't just say, hey, we're doing an impact fund, and then you're investing in high income properties in countries that have extreme oil and gas issues, or that have horrible working conditions, human rights issues, et cetera. And that's where we see a lot of pushback of, you can't put 10% of your portfolio in those sort of things. You need to put 0% of your portfolio in those sort of things. And you need to also have a fiduciary responsibility to your investors to continue to produce investment results. Unless you're, an endowment or a foundation, and they do sometimes have social goals that are very unrelated to investment performance, and that's fine as long as everyone knows that's what the goal is, and that's agreed upon. So there is a lot of pushback coming. We are just moving into Gen 3. But you will see a number of articles if you start Googling this topic, and rightly so, and you should be aware of these issues and be thinking about how do you avoid this sort of feedback and this sort of pushback. We're seeing lead certifications come off a bit over the last few years. Again, not to criticize lead, but to show that we are starting to move into a new generation of thinking about how do we balance investment performance and how do we create real results on our ESG goals? It should not just be I need to get a score exercise. And it's not good for you to just focus on I need a score. You should be focusing on, how do you have a fiduciary responsibility to your investors, and how do you produce real ESG results? So that brings us to Gen 3. So what is Gen 3? Number one is to focus on outcomes and goals. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but how do you find investment opportunities in a low carbon economy? It's not just a risk management exercise. It should definitely be a risk management exercise, but you should also focus on opportunities. And we are seeing lots of opportunities. There may be opportunities to increase and improve your investment performance. They may be opportunities to raise capital that you just didn't have before. And so we want to focus on both things, and we want to focus on those goals of what makes sense and what can you really do, what outcomes can you really produce that are important to all of your stakeholders on the ES and the G goals. So we'll talk about that more in a minute too. You should definitely have a very long-term perspective. So again, if I just have to get a score perspective, I'm focusing on right now and filling out that report, that's not going to help you, and it's not going to get you anywhere as far as really having investment results and really having outcomes on your ESG. So we're not thinking about this year. We're thinking about more of a 5 to 10 year path usually in real estate, and the municipalities will be thinking about much longer perspectives than that. One thing we want to do is we saw all those different frameworks and our head starts spinning, and there's different acronyms and there's whole different language the ESG people are talking. We really want to cut through all of that and just say, hey, what can we do as a company? What makes sense for us to do and what makes sense for us to have goals? And we're going to focus on those things first, because you cannot focus on everything and do a good job at everything. And it doesn't make sense to focus on everything. Particularly if you're a smaller to mid-sized company. We're going to build in effective loops, feedback loops and communication, not only on our goals, but also with our tenants, with our employees, and with our investors, to make sure that as markets change and as these ESG frameworks change, which they are rapidly changing right now, that we have a steady path for all the changes that are coming up. And then that really brings us to materiality. So what's materially important to our company? What makes a difference, and what's just a nice to have? And what do our investors think? What's important to them? What do our tenants think, and what's important to them? And what do our employees think? Because that helps us on tenant retention, helps us on leasing, it helps us on keeping our employees happy and our employee turnover low. And so these are real outcomes that we need to be considering. More information, we sent out a paper this fall. You can pull it out of Institutional Real Estate. We also sent one out through PREA that talk about these these sort of trends. So if you want more information, they're in those two papers. COP26, that's the United Nations Climate Conference that you probably heard quite a bit about back in November. McKinsey says this is the largest reallocation of financial capital in human history. I do truly believe this, just given the calls that we have coming into our office right now and the number of investors that are calling and just getting surprised of, an investor just required that we have to start reporting now. Or, hey, this investor won't even talk to us because we don't have a GREV score. We're just getting those kind of calls repeatedly and frequently right now. So again, something to start taking seriously and to, start educating, your staff and company about and thinking about how you move forward. So I'm going to talk about materiality and budgets because it's super important. We see scores and measurement. Those are the visible things that we see, but behind that are lots of policies and processes that are so important. And so they have to do with risk management and measuring and really forward thinking. Has to do with our management structure. How important is this to our senior management? Is it integrated into their compensation packages? Is it integrated into our board compensation packages? At what level the firm is involved and who does it really matter to? It has to do with strategy. So we think long-term. We want to think long-term about opportunities. What opportunities are going to come up because of the transitions that are happening in the market right now? And there's lots of them, I think, coming up. And then governance, again, don't just assume that you have governance under control because you have institutional investors and you've been passing all your governance due diligence questions. These really have to do with governance that has to do with ESG policies. So it's a different type of governance when we talk about governance. So here's a way that you might start thinking about creating effective outcomes, both again on the investment side and on the ESG side. So you'll see in the blue on the top right is to think about risks. And these may be regulatory requirements. So if you have buildings in New York, for example, are you going to have to start paying fines because it's just going to be too expensive to change out your HVAC systems to meet the requirements? If it is going to be too expensive, should you sell those buildings now? Should you just pay the fines? Those are things that you should be thinking about and modeling in your periodic budgeting exercises, just as an example. Insurance cost and coverage. I know everybody has their insurance brokers and their insurance programs. I would start thinking more long-term though. Are there markets where we have a lot of exposure to climate risk where maybe that's not built into pricing right now? So how do we think about that from a risk perspective? Do we diversify out of it? Do we sell buildings? Do we hold buildings? Do we have structural things with our buildings that make it lower risk? Or do we have more, microclimate, block type of issues that put our building at less risk? But I would be thinking very carefully in hold sell analyses of how that starts to play out and where those risks are and how are you mitigating those risks. Technology and operational efficiency, that is part of the ESG. It is part of the governance thing. So that's one of the governance components that you probably see already coming up in your due diligence questions. And it can sometimes benefit, I think, those larger companies than, the smaller companies. So how does that play into your ability to, not only, manage your energy and measure your energy, but to, report back to investors and to manage your properties. Governance, we talked about capital expenditures. Again, are you at risk because you're going to have to start spending a lot of money on certain buildings, particularly coming back to climate risks? Something to think about. My personal feeling, not data back, but my personal feeling is not seeing this built into exit cap rates, for example, and I'm not seeing it built into current cap rates. I don't know if anyone else is seeing that in the market right now. That's a great opportunity to think about your portfolio and what you're going to hold and what you're going to sell, particularly if you're a core investor and you have long-term hold periods in your portfolio. Those are the type of risk things. Those are things that have a direct impact to your bottom line, right? You can associate those things with a dollar number. So things to be very, very careful of and to be building into your processes. as you're thinking about your investment programs. There's also opportunities, again, that we can assign dollar numbers to these things. So they might be things like reducing your utility costs, reducing your operating costs. How do you do that? Well, it may be building in different lease structures, and we're seeing that quite a bit right now of lease structures and call them green leases that allow you that bring your interest and your tenant's interest, align them better, right? So if I have a lease where the tenant's paying the energy costs, then I don't really have an incentive to put in a new HVAC system because I don't pay the utility bills. So we don't have an alignment of interest, and vice versa. If the landlord's paying the energy costs, then the tenant doesn't have any incentive to use less energy and turn those lights off at night. So there's lots of ways to structure leases to align that. Certainly one of the low hanging fruit is to go in and put LED lights in there, et cetera, and do some building infrastructure that can have some big feedback. I will say I'm surprised if you do those sort of things, keep track of those costs and what the cost savings are, because your investors want to know that, number one, and you should know that, because then you know, hey, we do these sort of retrofits and we get a 50% return or a two-year payback period. And I do these sorts of retrofits and I only get maybe a 10% return, or I've got a 10-year payback period, et cetera. So it's good to be able to document those sort of things. You also maybe get asked for that information when you do ESG reporting. So definitely track your improvements if you're doing those sort of things. Clean energy, we're seeing people test out solar energy, different types of energy. Strategic construction, so maybe the construction materials. I haven't talked a lot about details. So you hear people talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and scope 3 would be the indirect building materials. Are you asking your contractors, your property managers, et cetera, do they have ESG programs in place? It's more indirect. I'd say that's lower priority. People are trying to focus on just scope 1 and 2, which are your direct utilities and where, the emissions created by those utilities. So, but we're definitely seeing interest for net zero buildings, because if you have a net zero goal, you're going to have to think about how to get there. And so definitely some interest, and that's a pretty ambitious scope. Lots of buildings are not going to ever get to net zero, but something to start thinking about. What's the difference in cost, and how do we even define the net zero word, which we'll leave to another day. Tenant satisfaction, it may be creating healthier buildings. There's certification programs to do that. Just asking your tenants, doing a feedback survey is very helpful. Find out what's important to them. That can help you in leasing and turnover, right? Reducing borrowing costs. There's some green financing. So if you meet certain requirements, maybe you get a green financing. Fannie Mae on the residential side is actually one of the biggest issuers of green bonds. So on residential, certainly something to be aware of is that Fannie Mae program, and to see if you can reduce costs. I don't know that there are huge cost reductions, but there are some cost reductions there, and maybe it gives you an option to finance that you wouldn't have had. So I would definitely be aware of that Fannie Mae green bond program. May help you on fundraising. So you hear the term greenwashing, that's kind of exaggeration or misleading statements about what you're doing. So be careful about that. But we are getting companies calling right now saying, this investor won't even look at us unless we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And so trying to put things in place in kind of a panic. So make sure you know your clients and who you're fundraising from. And it is changing rapidly right now. So operational resilience and portfolio construction investment opportunities, I kind of wrap these in one. These are very long-term frameworks, but definitely something to be thinking in place, both on the capital raising side, but most importantly on the investment side. You'll hear people talk about transition risks. So transition risks are the risk that things change and what, as maybe not getting priced in the market, starts to become priced into the market. So, so how do you build that into your long-term strategy? That's something that's going to become, very interesting to your investors if it's not already, and something where you may have significant opportunities both to reduce risk or to just invest in certain types of structures that are growing. So when we talk about green bonds, for example, when we talk about impact investing, I'll talk about that more in a minute. Those are things that are really kind of just starting up that you might want to at least kind of keep an eye on. Then we have lots of things up there in that gray box that are things that are really important, are not things that we can easily tie out to dollars. And so these are things that are important. I would understand the materiality, right? So that's one of our ESG words, materiality. That means how important are these things to your stakeholders? Your stakeholders are your investors, or your company owners, your company operational people, they're your tenants, they're your employees. How important are these things? And do they make a difference to you? And how much is it going to cost? And how does that tie into both your investment performance, and how does that tie into your goals? Like, can you truly make a difference on ESG? And be careful about these things. They're super important. If you spend a lot of money and you have lower investment performance, if you are a fiduciary, particularly under ERISA, you could come under criticism for this. If you're losing investment performance chasing these very, very good goals, but just be careful about your bottom line on these. And these have to do with things like building certifications, emissions measurement, health and well-being, diversity, equity, inclusion, biodiversity, community impact engagement, all great goals. Just be thoughtful, particularly if you're under the ERISA environment, about what this does to your bottom line and how you're going to prioritize. So you probably can't chase all of these and maintain your investment performance. So, so just be very careful about those things on gray. Again, they're great goals, but watch the investment side on those. So how might we think about just ESG performance through building operations? So I'm going to talk a little more granularly about what this means, and at the operations level and what you can do. Energy, water, and waste are big components. So just being able to measure those things, you would think, oh, I just pull my utility bills. Of course I can do that. An apartment's not so easy. We're seeing some investors have a lot of trouble even being able to measure utilities because it's paid by the tenants. And in some cases, they're really having difficulty just knowing how much utilities are getting used. So you can carve out, well, this is a common area, this is controlled by the owner, and these are the tenant areas, and these are controlled by tenants. But you need to know, ideally, how much utilities are getting used in both components. And that can be difficult. You can improve your ability to do that by having leases that allow you to collect that data. But that actually has proven to be a challenge for owners that have particularly net leases in place, and particularly in certain states, this can be difficult to do. So think about your lease structures. Think about how much can you even measure right now, because you need to be able to measure, test, set targets, and improve it. If you don't know how much you're using, you can't really improve that. These things may have to do with building level, so that may have to do with low water appliances, insulation, windows, etc. So retrofits. Again, if you're doing retrofits, keep track of your performance. That helps you focus on things that really make a difference. It also helps you focus on things that make a difference to your tenants, right? So if I do these things, do I have better leasing? Is this important to my tenants? Because, hey, I did that tenant feedback survey. I know these things are important to them. So keep track when you're doing that of what works better than other things. It may have to do with your landscaping and parking areas. So things like smart irrigation, native plants, reuse or capture storm and gray water, et cetera. Those are also important components. And these are big components of some of the scoring system. Waste, compost, reuse, recycle type of programs. We're seeing that tenants like that. Tenants expect to be able to, recycle. So I'm sure you all are closer than that than I am for some of you with more direct operations, but we're definitely hearing that these are things that tenants like to see as well. We talked about green leases, so make sure that you're aligning your tenants to also have an incentive to reduce energy and water. That could be through green your lease structure. It could just be through education programs. It could be through events at your properties. And we're definitely seeing those sort of things happening. Excuse me, we had talked about utility bills. You want to analyze and prepare for climate risk. We talked about that a bit. And then putting policies in place. Policies is another big component of it. So do you have policies to get feedback and to protect tenant employee health, safety, and are you educating on the importance of these things? On the opportunity side, we're seeing demand for sustainable investments, or what we call it. Also, we're seeing demand for impact investing and increasing. Impact investing is one that we are seeing quite a bit in the housing market, particularly to do with lower income, providing lower income and affordable housing. Something to think about. Impact investing has been really criticized for greenwashing. So you want to be very careful if you're going down the impact investing route, that you're not just saying, hey, we're doing affordable housing, and so therefore we're an impact fund. It's not that simple. There is a group, the United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. Ideally, you're identifying which of those 17 goals that you're aligning with, and then you are proving with facts and data how you are working towards these sustainable goals. We are seeing some big names move into this under the housing umbrella. So something to consider, particularly if you're in housing, but just be super careful that you're following some guidelines. There's another group called GIIN, Global Impacting Investment Network or something like that. I'm butchering their name, but it's GIIN. You can look that up, and they also help to just set some parameters around your impact investing goals. So approaches, so how do you implement this? It can seem overwhelming. So you're going to think about just build, integrate, and report, and then you're going to repeat this, and you're just going to get better every year. So start with a few things that are important, that you start with a framework that your priorities fit under. So first thing would be to talk to your stakeholders, figure out what's material, figure out what you think you can do, and then find a framework to help you set priorities that matches up to what your goals are. Don't do the reverse. Don't just pick a framework and say, we have to do this because we have to get a score. Pick a framework that actually measures, what your company can do and how it can be effective. One of the things that we're seeing people get surprised on quite a bit is how much time it gets ready. If you want to do reporting on ESG, I would allow at least a year. You're going to start just by identifying your stakeholders, what their priorities are. You're going to interview all of them. You're going to figure out how that fits to the different frameworks and what makes sense for you and your investors, because your investors are part of the stakeholders along with your tenants and your employees. And then you're going to address what gaps are there between that framework. It could take some time to put those gaps in place, particularly if those gaps have to do with measuring building utilities and emissions. And then you're going to think about how do you report that? So we're going to put these things in place. We need to put these sort of policies and process in place. We're going to have plenty of time to vet these, to understand them, to implement them. And then we have to set up some sort of key performance indicators, because we're going to start monitoring our goals on our targets that we've set to address those gaps. And then we're going to start reporting. So I would allow a minimum of a year to get ready to do this, which is why I say I would get ready now, because if an investor just says, hey, you got to start doing this, you don't have time to put all this stuff in place. And finally, just remember, it's okay to start small. And if you're a small firm, it's okay to be small. You don't have to have the same things integrated that a gigantic firm with offices across the world has in place. So you probably want to just start figuring out what's in place, figure out what your goals are, what can you actually do effectively, probably put some policies and processes in place. You're going to set some ways to measure that, some targets and some metrics. And then, you might have a short corporate sustainability report, for example, and that may be fine for a very small firm. As you get larger and as you grow, you're going to repeat back through this and say, okay, what's not in place, what's working and what's not working, and we're going to make some changes, and we'll keep going through this until you get to the bottom of the screen, which is really for very large firms that have a long time standing. But if you have 5 employees, it doesn't make sense that you have a full-time corporate ESG person, for example. It just doesn't make sense to do it. So it's okay to be small, and you can accomplish a lot as a small company. So understand that you don't have to have this same thing in place as these giant firms do. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I see some things in the chat and I can't see the chat. So I'm going to stop and open it up for questions. So let me see. Yep.
Well, Paige, I want to thank you for really an exceptionally detailed, broad, wide-ranging and helpful presentation. And yes, we do have a couple of questions. A repeated series of questions are asking, will there be a copy of the PowerPoint deck? Will there be a recording? Well, of course, the recording is going to be posted to our YouTube channel. And NAA typically doesn't make decks available, but I'll leave it to you, Paige. I guess if people want it, they can approach you directly. Would that make the most sense?
I think that's fine. Both of our emails are here. So if you want the deck, just email us and we can figure out a way to get it to you.
All right, excellent. Well, we had an interesting question from a person. It says, I started a business focused on plastic waste reuse within multifamily, specifically refilling home and personal care products. Curious if there's ever an opportunity to connect. Love to learn more about NAA and if any opportunities to meet and learn more. Well, best way to really connect with the heart and soul of NAA is to join and attend our Apartmentalized conference. This year, it's going to be in San Diego in June, I believe, off the top of my head, June 22nd to the 24th. Pre-COVID, we would have, anywhere between 10 and 12,000 attendees. You're going to get the heart and soul of the rental housing industry there. Great networking, great information. There's well over 100 educational sessions. And I don't know if we have one on ESG, but who knows, maybe we'll have to work toward that in the future. So that was another question, great question. And just someone said, amazing, thank you, with a smiley face. And I would concur with that, Paige. I think amazing and thank you. Any other
thank
questions?
you. I'm glad there's, go ahead.
We still have a few more minutes before we're going to sign out. Any further questions for Paige? Well, again, you've got her contact information there. If you need to follow up with her, just email her directly. I'm sure she'd be happy to respond.
Absolutely.
So again, just to finish up here on our side, for additional resources, NAA maintains an online portal for its many offerings and operations solutions for the rental housing industry. The URL is featured below. Next slide, please. I especially wish to highlight NAA's Mental Health Awareness Week. We've partnered with the National Council for Mental Wellbeing to present a series of 4 webinars addressing mental health issues felt keenly within the rental housing industry. Topics include handling stress for maintenance teams, responding to trauma, mitigating employee burnout, and coping strategies for on-site staff. These 4 webinars will be hosted during the week of May 2nd. They are free to join, so make sure to register today. Next slide, please. Finally, if you've enjoyed today's webinar and would like to view more, you can always visit our YouTube channel for those many NAA webinars that are now viewable on demand. The URL is featured below. So last slide, please. Again, I wish to thank everyone for attending and participating. Your participation means the world to us. I especially want to thank Paige. This was really an exceptionally informational tactic and presentation, and gave us all huge amounts to think about and to prepare for. So grateful for your presentation. So thanks to all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, enjoy.